Hey guys, how's it going? It's Al. I have a bonus upload for you on YouTube this week. I have Drew Dinkmeyer here from DailyRoto.com, one of the founders at DailyRoto.com and one of the best daily fantasy players of all time, is joining me once again here on the channel. And we're going to go over how to be better, how to win at daily fantasy on Draftkings in 2019, and how you're going to use optimizers and projections to make yourself a better fantasy player. So we're going to focus on the optimizer and the projections at Daily Roto. I'm going to talk to Drew about basically how do they build the projections at Daily Roto? How can you as a user use them very simply to cut down your research time, to not have to do all the digging that he does. He's going to go over his process of how they go through the projections, how they grind news and really build them. They're a top-down approach, meaning that they start with the Vegas lines and they get down through how the teams are going to play and their percentage of run and pass, and then how it trickles down to the individual players. So he's going to get into that and break it down for you guys in depth. I appreciate all the love on the channel so far this preseason. This is going to be my last preseason video for 2019 fantasy football. And then we're just getting into the grind week to week. First looks, recaps, 5 picks, Q&A for lineup building, Thursday night football, Monday night football, Edge podcast, and everything else. So I appreciate all the love. Please drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, ring that notification bell, because as I said, there's going to be at least 5 or 6 new videos every single week on YouTube. And if you'd be so kind, right down below in the pinned comment down below is a link to my Instagram page. I'm trying to build that account over there. If you would be so kind as to give me those 2 extra clicks to click the Instagram page and click the follow button, it would mean a lot to me. Thank you guys very much. I'm going to bring in Drew very quickly. Right here, we have the Daily Roto front page. From here, you click on NFL, you go down to Optimizer, and this is going to take you to the Daily Roto Optimizer. This has basically all the information that you want to know. It's fully customizable. Drew, can you tell the people, one, how do you guys build these projections? And then we'll get into how do you go about building a cash game lineup, a tournament lineup for single entry or 3 max, and then all the different functionalities and customized ability that you have on this optimizer if you're building 20, 100, or 150 lineups.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me, Al. So the way we thought about projections and with regards to NFL is we thought about taking kind of a top-down approach, as you outlined. So we know Vegas is very good and very efficient in terms of NFL lines and totals in their market. So we're gonna use the books as a guiding point and as our first point of reference. So we take those totals in those spreads and convert them into implied totals for the opposing teams. And then from there, we look at historically what teams with those types of implied totals and those types of overall game totals, what that looks like for plays, what that looks like for pass run distribution. We mix in the historic play calling of the play callers that are responsible for setting the offensive direction for those teams. And we then come up with an estimate of both their total offensive plays and how that's broken out between pass and run, and how their touchdowns are usually broken out by pass and run. From there, we have a whole expectation of like how many touchdowns they're going to score offensively, how many are going to be passing, how many are going to be running, how many plays are going to be running, how many are passing, how many are going to be running. And then we kind of just start filtering down the pieces of the pie to all the individual players to make the projection.
Okay, so as you mentioned, I'm gonna move this off in a little bit. So this top bar is all the teams, so that people can really see the projections down below. You have the Kansas City Jacksonville game, and you have every game that's on the main slate. As you see up here, you can choose what slate you want. The projections exist for every different site. You can see the values. First thing, explain this top bar to the folks.
Yeah, so basically our game output view, which you can put it in, you can put it on the top, you can put it on the side, you can remove it all together, is basically the starting point that funnels down to all the projections. And this is actually an area that's customizable as well. So you can change a team's implied total, you can change a team's number of plays, and that will funnel through right down to the projections. So if you were, for example, to take Kansas City's implied total from the 27-28 range and bump it up to like 33, you'd see Patrick Mahomes and Damian Williams and Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce, all their projections would go up. because we're now expecting them to score more points. So one of the cool things about the way we've built out all these projections is that they're customizable for the user and for the subscriber, so that they can test different scenarios themselves. And if they have different opinions from, let's say, Vegas lines, they can put that opinion directly into the projections and see how things move.
Okay, so very quickly, I've now adjusted Kansas City's team total up from where it was originally up to 33. Let's say I screwed up. There's a massive 6 misclicks here. How do I get back to setting it back to normal?
That little arrow that's under the save disk, you can simply just click that back and it'll go right back to the original team total, and it'll go right back to all the individual player projections.
And if you're clicking around on DailyRoto, if you hover over any of these things here, it will tell you exactly what they mean in a little pop-up window: projected yards per target, projected individual market share of team targets, projected individual market share of team rushing touchdowns, etc., etc., etc. So everything is very explainable. Right here we have the public percentage. This is what they project the ownership to be in larger field GPPs. And this boost button, you talked about how to change it by adjusting the team total, and that will change how many plays they run. It'll also change all the projections. What about this boost total? Boost percentage, sorry.
That's just like a quick hitter that we had, that for when people are like last minute trying to run something and they feel like they're not getting enough of an individual team, you can just kind of click the boost and you can boost up the percentage of a player. You can also do it on the team level and kind of the game boxes up at the top, but the boost categories themselves are just a percentage. So, you had Patrick Mahomes there at 25 for a second. That was like Patrick Mahomes' original projection times 25% added on. So the boost is just a simple way of, each point is a percentage point added or subtracted from the projection. If you just said, hey, like, I think this guy, I'm getting too much of him in my optimizer runs, I don't want this much, but I don't want to put in an exposure cap, you can simply kind of move the projection around with boost as well.
Okay, so basically all of these columns are completely customizable.
Yep.
And the ones that are going to change the player projection, obviously the market share things will definitely change the player projections quickly. If you think that Damian Williams is not going to see 57% of the rushing total, if you think he's going to see 71%, which is closer to historically what Coach Reed has given, you're going to see that immediately changes the outlook here. And again, the little undo circle resets to baselines here. So he goes from a 20-point fantasy projected day at 71% of the market share rushes down to about an 18.56 if he's at 57.7. So what else do I need to know about the projections page, Drew?
Yeah, so in terms of the main thing there is just like, we have all this description, we have all the projections right in front of you. So if there's anything where you feel like, okay, this player isn't projecting high enough or they're projecting too low, you can actually see the math that we're putting out there. You can kind of back end the calculation. And there's actually, on the settings feature, there's an output tab that'll show you, instead of the customizable fields, it'll show you the projected pass attempts or the projected rushes or the projected receptions and different things like that. And so you can see what our actual projections are for these players as well, if you wanted to do that instead of look at the customizer. So the idea that we want to have is that everything is transparent. It's in front of you. You can see where our projection is derived from, because it all comes from that top-down process. And then if you have differences of opinions, you can infuse those into the projections through a number of different ways.
Okay, perfect. So now that we've talked about how you do the projections, I need to talk about, or our viewers, kind as they are, need to know how they can use this to build a cash game lineup. How do they use the DailyRoto projections to build a cash game lineup?
Sure. So the first thing, it depends on if you're trying to build really quickly or if you're trying to kind of build by hand and get an idea of what players are going to be involved. The first thing that I like to do whenever I'm looking at a slate is I like to just kind of sort through the positions and sort by value and see, okay, where are there positions that there are big gaps in value? Like when you start at the quarterback position, you'll basically see that everybody is projected somewhat similarly in terms of value. Like the range on the top 20 quarterbacks is only like 2 points difference in terms of value. So that to me suggests, okay, this is a position that is not super important for me to get right, because any of the options I'm picking are going to project somewhat similarly. But if you went to running back, for example, or wide receiver, you might see situations where there's only a few players that are projecting, 4 to 5 points ahead of everybody else in terms of value. And those players, to me, are the ones that stand out as players that I should be really focusing on or narrowing down my player pool for consideration for my cash game lineups. And that's one of the first things I do. Certainly, if you were just going to come to the site and you wanted to see what our optimal lineups look like, you could simply choose your slate, run optimizer, assuming you had vanilla settings on, you didn't have any stack settings or anything like that, and you would get an idea of what optimal, in our opinion, cash game lineups look like. And you can see player exposures and different things like that. That'll give you an idea of what the player pool might look like. But for me, the first thing I like to visually do before I even run the optimizer is just get a sense of, okay, where is their tight value, what positionally, and what positions have lots of value that I'm going to have many choices to choose from.
Can you quickly explain the value calculation? Because what is most
Sure.
people, it's kind of a random number on DailyRoto. I get what it means, and green is good and red is bad. But it has Nick Chubb at 5.12. So what goes into that 5.12?
So what it is the value threshold that we have. So value for us is just projection minus value threshold. And value threshold is a simple calculation based on a player's salary. So for us, it's a multiplier and then plus a constant. And we keep that value threshold constant throughout all positions. So that's why you might see certain positions that get priced down. You'll see quarterback gets priced down a little bit. You'll see all these guys are positive values. Whereas other positions, there won't be as many players that are positive values because the pricing is a little bit tighter at those positions. And so for us, when we're saying Nick Chubb is a positive 5.12 value, that means his projection of 20.92 points is 5.12 points ahead of what we would expect a player for 6,400 to be worth. And so that means we expect a player that's priced at 6,400 to generally get around 15.8 DraftKings points.
Okay. And very quickly, for time's sake, right? And for communication's sake, I typically just give people a round multiplier, which obviously, as you've discussed over the years and we've discussed over the years, doesn't always work, right? You can't just say, 3x is value, because that's way too kind to the low end and way too harsh on the high end. So the 9K guys, to reach value for that salary, really don't need 27 DraftKings points at running back. And the 3K guys, 9 points does not really help you, though it doesn't hurt you. It's very easy for me to communicate in that way, instead of the multiplier plus a constant, which is the way that you guys go, and explaining that to the masses kind of muddies things. I use both, and I use them as a range, right? So for a min salary guy, he needs to get between 9 and 13 fantasy points for me. The high guy needs to get between 23 and 27 fantasy points for me to fall in his range of values. You guys tend to lean more on the multiplier plus a constant. Can you explain that without everybody's eyes glazing over?
Yeah, so very quickly, what you described, Al, is a multiplier plus a constant is just friendlier to all salary ranges. So when you have the multiplier itself, you generally will, if you sorted by value and you just had a multiplier, it would be all the cheap guys would be the best values on the slate. If you did, just point totals, all the expensive guys would be. So a multiplier plus a constant just kind of balances out for us. Our formula for DraftKings is 2x plus 3, meaning 2 times the salary plus 3, and obviously in the salary you're dividing by 1,000 there. So Nick Chubb at 6,400, 2 times 6,400 would be 12,800, plus 3 would be 15.8, right? So that's our value. Our expected threshold is 15.8 for a 6,400 player. So the reason we do it is just so that when we sort by value, you don't get just all the cheap guys, because people often then will start building lineups by just plugging in the top values, and they'll plug in these cheap guys and they'll be like, oh, I have this lineup that's the best values according to DailyRoto, but it's got $3,000 left on the salary cap. What do I do now? And so this is just an easier way to smooth that out for us.
So you're saying leaving 3,000 on the table is not optimal?
Not a great strategy usually in these sports that projections are pretty good.
Don't leave 3,000 in salary ever again. Got it. All right. So now that we've got that, we know how to build our cash game lineup. We know how to use it to identify the best values on the slate. We got to get into using this optimizer. Now, there are different ways to use an optimizer. You can use the DailyRoto optimizer to help you find the optimal lineup. As Drew said, just run it through very vanilla with no restrictions or anything else. I would suggest limiting your player pool before you did that, right? Just to get the optimal. You don't want guys that are getting less points than they really need to. You don't want players that are lower than a specific value threshold. You want to build the absolute best lineup. Drew, why don't you take us through some settings and explain all of this, the exposures, the shuffle, the volatility, which is brand new this year to the DailyRoto optimizer. Shuffle was broken down into just overall shuffle. Now you've broken it down positionally. Explain from top to bottom, exposures, what they are, shuffle, volatility, and some guidelines on how they can be used by the user.
Yeah, so we've got some new bells and whistles in the settings. And the first thing to think about with the settings is these settings are global settings. So they're things that are going to be applied to every single lineup that you create. So that's the first thing to kind of keep in mind. The other thing that we've added is the ability to create different settings groups. So if you use that checkbox or that plus sign in the top right, you will be able to create a specific settings group that you could have. Like it could be DraftKings main slate, it could be DraftKings showdown, it could be DraftKings small slates, and you can toggle between these different settings characteristics to create different types or sets of lineups for different slates, should you wish. So that's one thing that we added, is the ability to kind of create different settings groups and save all those, and those will carry over week after week after week. So you can have your desired personal taste of how you're going to use the optimizer carry over from week to week to week. You don't have to rebuild it every week. In terms of these categories that are under this settings area, the first one is exposures, and that one's pretty standard. It's just saying what is the maximum amount of any one player from this position that I would want in my lineups. And so for me, I always start, when I'm first using the optimizer, I leave everything at 100 until I start implementing all the other different things that I want. And then I see if there's things that I need to limit. Because I like to start as broad as possible with optimizers and then kind of hone in on the areas that I think need to be adjusting. I think this is the best way to use optimizers. If you start off at the very top and you say, hey, I only want a quarterback at max 15 and a running back at max 20, and then you start narrowing the player pool down, you're constraining the optimizer so much that it might not even be able to create enough lineups that you're looking for. So I like to start broad and then focus in. But exposures is one way that you can control the overall maximum individual ownership level of an individual player. You can do it by position, or you can do it by all. When you do edit any of these alls, you just have to click the red all button for it to apply to all the rest.
So like that, if I put 50 in there, boom, it just sets everything to 50.
Yep.
Boom. Perfect. So I can put everybody back to 100 to start. That's kind of a good tip. It's right off of what I say about cooking, right? You can, if you just immediately pour in all the salt, it's inverted from cooking. If you immediately pour in all of the salt, you can't put less salt in later.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So salt it a little bit, taste it, and you can put a little bit more. So it's building these lineups works the opposite. Start with 100 and then whittle it down from there as you want the optimizer to do certain things. And as I always like to say, you have to find different ways to make the optimizer dance. There is nobody.
That's right.
In any site. One, an optimizer is only as good as the projections that you put into it. Two, an optimizer, if you go to a site and you say, all right, well, I bought a subscription to DailyRoto. Here's their things. Come down here, click this big red run optimizer button. Go ahead and transfer that money, DraftKings. I won. Not how this works. You got to spend time learning to make this optimizer dance, just like any other optimizer.
It's also not a slot machine in that if you have the specific combination, that it rains money down. A lot of times people will ask what settings do you recommend? And that's a really hard question for me to answer because I don't use the same settings every single week. I'm often a salt to taste type of user with the optimizer, where I will run the optimizer dozens of times during the course of the week until I start to see player distributions and lineups that look the way that I want them. Oftentimes, my very first run of the optimizer, I'm screening the lineups to see, okay, what are issues that I'm seeing that are coming up here in these lineups that I want to make decisions on. So for week one, we have 2 Carolina receivers projecting really well in DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel. And if you run generic optimals, you'll get a lot of them together, or similarly with Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen. And so then I'll say, okay, do I want these two players together in all these lineups, even if they're not paired with their quarterback? And I'll make decisions like that, and I'll keep adjusting settings on the optimizer. So I run the optimizer many, many times during the course of the week until I have my final upload.
Yeah, you got to train it just like anything else. You got to work through it, run it a bunch of times, get reps, get practice to get it to dance the way you want. So let's explain these things, and then we'll get into building groups, and we'll get into why we build groups, how we limit our player pool, and everything else on this video. So Shuffle, explain Shuffle quickly.
So Shuffle very quickly is a way to get a little bit more of a distribution in your lineup. So what Shuffle does is the higher the shuffle you go, the more likely it's saying that this player that was used to generate lineup 1 is now less likely to get into lineup 2. And you can now do this positionally. So for me, what I think of it is as it's a way to get a wider spread of the player pool. And so for me, what I think about it in terms of NFL terms, let's say that I feel very confident in running backs and I want to run a tight pool of running backs. Well, I'm not going to use Shuffle at the running back position. But let's say the wide receivers is one where I want a little bit more spread. And so I don't want the top values just jamming into the optimizer a bunch. I will up the shuffle on the wide receiver position specifically because I know that's a position that has a little bit more volatility associated with it. I know it's a position that's a little bit harder to project. So that's the idea behind Shuffle. The idea behind Shuffle is very simply that you're trying to give yourself a little bit wider spread of the distribution of players used. There's a couple different tools that we have that do similar things. So you might not need to use them all in tandem, but Shuffle is the one that is solely dedicated to trying to differentiate your player pool a little bit.
And now you can separate that out into positions. So if you're trying to build the ultimate optimal lineup based on the DailyRoto projections, setting Shuffle to 0 would spit out as many lineups as close to the optimal as it can. If you were to up that to, let's say, 30% or 35%, that's going to shuffle every position at 35%. But as you said, if you want to focus on a smaller group of running backs, set this lower. If you want to focus on a larger group of wide receivers, set that higher. That's how you utilize Shuffle. So let's get this back to 0 and let's move on to volatility.
Yeah, volatility is a new one for us. And what volatility is it has a similar effect to Shuffle in terms of getting you a little bit of a broader set. But what it's doing is it doesn't care who was in the previous lineup before. Shuffle cares who was in the previous lineup before because it's saying, now that you've been used, I want to make it less likely to use you. What volatility does is it's a percentage, again, think of it as a percentage from 0 to 100. And it's a percentage that is adjusting in this view globally by position or all. The percentages, it's giving a range of outcomes. So let's say, for instance, the quarterback volatility we were going to set to 10%, right? So what it's doing is for every lineup that it's going to create, it's going to create a range of projections for each quarterback plus or minus 10%, and it's going to grab it for a specific lineup. So in this instance, if we're doing 10% volatility at quarterback for Kyler Murray, who's got a 20.97 projection, let's make the math easier. And let's say his projection was 21. 10% would mean that the projection range is now going to use plus or minus 2.1. So it's going to go from essentially 18.9 to 23.1, making sure I'm doing my math right.
Yeah.
18.9 to 23.1. And it's going to take a number that's random between that. And it's going to do that for if you use it in this settings, which is global for the quarterback, it's going to do that for every quarterback. So what it does is it's still keeping projections as your base, but it's opening up the range of outcomes for those projections, which will naturally make your pool a little bit more diversified in terms of the exposures that you're getting, because sometimes it's going to grab Kyler Murray at 10% worse. Sometimes it's going to grab him at 10% better. Sometimes it's going to grab him 5% worse, so on and so forth. So it's going to naturally diversify your player pool a little bit more by creating a distribution that suggests, hey, we know that the projections aren't perfect, and so we're trying to give a wider range of outcomes. And sometimes you're going to get Kyler Murray 10% worse and Carson Wentz 10% better, and sometimes you're going to get the reverse.
Yeah, Kevin89 in chat asked, does it go up and down? Yes. It basically,
yes.
The projections as set right now, and we can change this down in the settings section, are based on the median projection, right? You can also set the DailyRoto projections for a floor projection or based on ceiling. What this does is it takes the median projection and then works in a range. So you're getting more of the meat of the bell curve instead of the absolute 50th percentile outcome. You're getting a little bit more of that meat of the bell curve. So sometimes he's going to be on the high end of the meat. Sometimes he's going to be on the little, the little fatty portion, not get that much meat. So depending on how big you set that volatility to be, if it's 10% on a 20 point projected player, it's going to go, instead of viewing him, the optimizer, instead of viewing him as only 20 projected points, the optimizer will view him randomly from 18 to 22.
Yeah, and you can do that globally within the settings here, or you can do that on like individual players, right? Mm-hmm. So like a player like Amari Cooper or Tyreek Hill, players that are really volatile, you can actually change their volatility individually at the player level and say, hey, I don't want to put this on a whole position, but I want to do this for an individual player. And then what the projections are doing is they're taking that range for every individual lineup that's run through the set of 150.
Right. So is this something I can save every week to just have Amari Cooper be 90% volatility?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if the player level edits will carry over on the settings. I think they will on a week-to-week basis.
I just want it for Amari.
Yeah.
That's really the only one that I think needs it. Like every week, 90% volatility.
He's either getting 50 or he's getting 6. It's one of the two.
Right. So I want to capture that in my projections. And I don't even want 90%. I want the bottom 10 and the top 10. Can I focus on that? Or are we waiting a couple years for that sort of projectability to come out?
So what we have is, and it's not displayed right now, it's actually getting put in today, is our range of outcomes projections where you can choose the range that you'd like on a player. So we have the categories that we have are, I believe, 10th, 25th, standard, 75th, and 90th percentile, and you can choose those are applied though to everybody. They're not applied just on the individual player.
I need some Amari only sliders, which sound delicious, but I don't think they really are. Maybe twice a year they're good, but we'll see how it goes.
When they're good, they're really good.
They're really, really good. Minimum projection sounds pretty obvious at quarterback. If we sort by QB again, this is a way to limit your player pool right here, this minimum projection. So like, let's say I sort by points instead of value. I don't want any quarterback that's got less than 16 fantasy points. I know that's not going to limit it by all that much because there's only like 4, but if I say 18, that's going to cut off everybody here from Marcus Mariota down, right? So that's going to cut off players from your player pool without having to X them out here, right? We spoke on the other day about how I do it. I just go through and I hit none. And then I'm like, well, yes, Cam, yes, Jameis, yes, Goff, and I just go through, and the ones that I don't. Like I said, I'm old school, guys. I can't help it. All right. It is what it is. You click all, everybody goes back and play. If you want to do it quickly through the optimizer, you just set minimum projection for here. Running backs, what running back do how many points do you want minimum from your running backs? Let's say 12 or 13, right? If you're a little bit more lenient with your value guys, you could say 11. It'll cut off everybody. If you're at 11, Chris Thompson and down, Balaj, Drake, Penny, Lewis, Breida. My question is, if I have volatility on and I have a minimum projection on, will it X these guys out that are sub here? Like if I have 10% on Chris Thompson, will it only capture the range of Chris Thompson that's above 11?
So what it will do is it's pre-selecting your player pool. So anybody that is below that number to start, even if volatility's on and they get above that number in there, they won't get into the player pool.
Okay, fine. So that good answer there. I like that. Now, stacking. Very important for building multiple tournament lineups. Obviously, the highest correlation in any sort of fantasy football environment is between the quarterback and his pass catchers. Some running backs fall into that pass catcher role. Saquon Barkley, CMC, Le'Veon Bell while he was in Pittsburgh. All these guys that get you, David Johnson when he's actually being used properly, are going to get 6 to 12 targets in a game. They're getting over 20% of the market share of targets. They are people that you want to stack with a quarterback. So this is quarterback stacking rules. And one more thing that I want Drew to talk about as well is the philosophy of bringing it back. I'll use air quotes, bringing it back. Why should we stack? How many players should we stack with? What is bringing it back? And then how do we utilize it within this settings tool for the optimizer on DailyRoto?
Yeah, so stacking is super important, and Colin Drew, goes by Drewby417 on Twitter. He did a big article for us on stacking over the last few years. He actually did a huge GPP strategy guide article for our subscribers this year that highlights some snippets of these articles. But essentially, the shortened version, the too long didn't read version, is that most people aren't stacking enough. And you should be often stacking multiple pass catchers with your quarterback, and you should be often bringing it back with a player to kind of increase your correlation and bring some of those game stacks in. So this setting that we have, again, these are global settings that we're working through, which means whenever anything in this settings box is touched, it is being applied to every single lineup that you create. So if you wanted to create lineups that were all stacked exactly the same way, but use, perhaps different quarterbacks, you would go into this setting and you would choose, how you would want those stacks to look. And you can choose it by the position level. You can say, I only want wide receivers. You can say, I only want wide receivers or running backs. I only want wide receivers or tight ends. I don't care at all. I'll take anybody that's on the same team as this player. And you can do that with the opponent as well. Right beneath that is another cool little category that we have, which is teammates without QB, which means how many lineups, how many players from the same team do you want in a lineup maximum without their QB? And so getting back to that initial example that I gave where both the Minnesota wide receivers, Thielen and Diggs, and the Carolina wide receivers, DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel, are projecting well for us early, they will get into a lot of lineups if you don't restrict them, because the optimal is saying, hey, I'm going to choose just the best players. I don't care what team they play for. And you might not want that, because that might not be optimal for a tournament situation to play two wide receivers without their quarterback. So you can change that teammates without QB button down to 1, and that'll immediately make it so that the only times multiple teammates are in the same lineup together is when they're used with a quarterback.
If you put it at 1, it'll stop you from game stacking though, correct?
If you define game stacking as having multiple skill players from both sides, yes.
I mean, okay, I'm defining game stacking as 2 players from both teams. And a quarterback from one of them.
So 2 players from both teams, yes. Right. So it would allow 2 players from the team that you use your quarterback,
but
it would allow only 1 player from the opponent if you had it at 1. If you had it at 2, it would allow 2.
Game stacking is all the vogue right now. It's very, very en vogue.
I personally do most of my stacking through groups and rules as opposed through the global setting. But the global setting is certainly a way that you can have all of a specific lineup type that you're trying to create created quickly.
All right. So if I set this to 1, but in a group, I say use 2.
This will overwrite.
Okay. So you have to leave this at 2, essentially.
This is the global.
If you want to game stack with my 2+2+ QB.
Yeah. And you can bump it up too. You can go to 3 or 4 or whatever you'd like. But I generally create most of my stacking rules through groups.
You left this on 3 as a standard because you're still tilting about that Russ Wilson and 3 Broncos pass catchers lineup that I had from 4 years ago, aren't you?
Still very, we are all very upset about that lineup.
It was so good.
It was so frustrating.
All right, running back plus DST. The correlation between a running back and his defense. If the defense is doing well, that means that the team is probably winning, and that means that the running back is going to get a lot of second half touches. In theory, is this something I see that it standard is unchecked? Is this a button that we should check or not?
I don't think so. So I think it's a correlation that people do like to have. And if you want to run lineup specifically, we have the quick feature to check it. You just check that button and you'll get that. I don't think so personally. I think with what we've added with Key Boost is a better way to do that. And we can talk about that later.
Okay, perfect. So going through all these things, desired lines, 150, uniques. Uniques is how many different players are in every lineup. So if you have the optimizer make you lineups, it's going to build a lineup with, I don't even remember how many players we have, 8, right? So like you put all the players in a lineup, the next lineup it builds, it's going to probably, if you leave this at 1, it's going to build a lineup and it's going to change 1 player from that first lineup and get you the next highest amount of points it can build. And in NFL, the closest score in projections is defense. So like if it's got the Ravens in lineup number 1, it's probably going to have the Jets in lineup number 2 or something similar to that. Like defense is going to be the first thing to get shuffled out. So in football last year, I was going with 2 uniques, but is there a reason to go with more than 2 for NFL when building whether 20 lineups or 100 lineups or 50 lineups or whatever?
So the way to always think about this is just another tool in a way to create differentiation in your lineups. So if you're getting the differentiation naturally through shuffle or volatility, I don't think you necessarily need to worry about using it too much in uniques. If you're running sets and you're seeing, like, the biggest challenge that optimizers have is what we call clumping, which means a couple of the top values all get used together and then they don't get kind of spread out amongst each other. And so your lineups end up being very dependent on a few players being overly correlated in your lineups when they're not correlated in real life. And so what we're trying to do is give you multiple tools to separate those good values. So sometimes they're together in your lineups, but they're not exclusively together in your lineups. And uniques is one way to do that. Volatility is one way to do that. And shuffle is one way to do that. I generally will run unique somewhere between 2 and 3. It kind of depends on the slate. On showdowns, I'll run them at 1 because it's a really tight slate.
Less lineup spots, less players to choose
from. Exactly. So it depends a little bit, but I generally am running somewhere between 2 and 3. A sport like golf, which is really high variance, I'll run more. I'll run like 3 or 4 sometimes. So it just kind of depends. But these are all tools that can be used to try to reduce that clumping effect that is such a challenge for optimizers.
Max public owned, as we mentioned before, this column here, if you can look at this one, it's all zeros right now. As the week goes on and we get closer to kickoff, DailyRoto pulls projected percentage owned for tournaments from these players. A lot of work has been done. An article's been read about the majority, or 75 or 80% of all the Millie Maker winners in history have had less than 140% total ownership if you add up all of their players. So you can set this, if you're building cash game lineups, set it to 900, whatever. If you're building tournament lineups, you could set it to 140. If you want to try and build more contrarian lineups, set it to like 90, right? The lower you set this, it's going to look for lower owned players to fill those lineups as it builds. D versus O. Are you going to allow an offensive player in a lineup that has a defense in it?
Which generally for me is generally a 0, but on like showdown slates,
showdown slates, you need all the defenses against your teams. Position and flex.
Position and flex is just if you have a specific choice, like you say, I don't ever want to have a tight end in flex, you just uncheck that button.
It's 100% of the time for me.
So
salary. So from max salary, how much you want to leave on the table. And it'll build lineups that won't leave less. Like if you want to leave 800 on the table, you set 49,200 to 50,000. Right. So it won't build any lineups that have 900 or more left in salary. And this stuff here is how it looks. Now, most importantly, when building lineups through an optimizer, as we said before, you can't just run in, hit run optimizer and count your money, right? You're not going to become Scrooge McDuck by just clicking the big red button on the bottom of the screen. Got to do some work. Groups is where you do that work. Go for it, Drew.
Yeah, so groups, there's a lot of different things you can use groups for. And the way that I think about groups is these are setting generally like if-then rules for the optimizer. So the global settings are things that are going to apply to every single lineup. These are settings that are going to apply to specific types of lineups. So you can set rules that will apply to every lineup. Like you could say, I want max 2 of or max 1 of the high-end running backs on the slate because I don't want to have GPP lineups that are going to have like Saquon Barkley and Christian McCaffrey and then not have salary room for everybody else. So you can create a rule that says, I want at most 1 of Saquon Barkley, Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara, whoever the top backs on the slate are. Or you can create a lot of your stacking rules through this group section, and that's often what I do. And that's why I use this more frequently than I do the global settings for stacks, because what it allows me to do is differentiate the types of stacks or allow for certain quarterbacks to be used in my player pool that I'm comfortable running without stacks with, which would we call naked, which are like Cam Newton or Lamar Jackson, running-oriented quarterbacks that can reach their upside without their other receivers kind of coming along for the ride.
All right, so let's get into building some stacks. Why don't we start with, since your optimizer is right now viewing the Panthers as their pass catchers as great options, I can make Cam Newton the key by clicking on this handy dandy little key right here. So he is the key player. This is a Cam Newton key. Lineups with Cam Newton And then I have to add players to this. So I can add McCaffrey. I can add Samuel. Anybody who's watched my videos knows how I feel about him. Moore, Olsen. And then here's my actual question. Should we add the players coming back to this group, or should I make a separate Cam Newton key group with the players coming back?
Separate group. So the reason you want a separate group is because if you lumped in all the players from the Rams in here, you might actually get lineups where Cam's not even stacked, because you might say like exactly 2 or at least 2, and it just happens to choose those Rams players. So generally the way that I make stacks is that I'll name a stack, Cam Newton stack, and then I'll name Cam Newton bring back as kind of my second group. And I will do that through kind of all the quarterbacks that I want to use on a given slate. And so from here, once you have the key player identified, what this is saying is that any lineup that Cam Newton is selected, I'm now going to follow, the optimizer is now going to follow these rules. And so the rules are use, and you can say at least, at most, exactly, or between the list of players that you've added. So in this case, you could say, every time I have Cam Newton in a lineup, I want to use at least 2 of his pass catchers. And so you'd have Christian McCaffrey, Curtis Samuel, DJ Moore, Greg Olsen. And every lineup that Cam Newton gets into, there will be at least 2 of those guys populated in it. This is where you can also, though, key boost. And so let's save this group. Let's save this Cam Newton group. And then let's create a Cam Newton kind of bring back group, which I think this is where I think I'm going to use key boost most frequently.
Okay.
So you would have
another Cam Newton.
Another Cam Newton key.
Okay, so I got Cam Newton key and Cam Newton BB.
Yeah.
So add player. I'm going to add all of the... Am I wrong, or did there used to be like a add player to the key group? I could just do this without searching. Right? Isn't it here? Add this player to the working group. Yes, it was there. I'm not stupid.
Little plus guy. Yeah.
So add Brandon Cooks. Add Cooper Kupp. Where's Woods? Sort by Rams would be the faster way to do this.
Yeah.
I'm going to act like I've done this before. Been 9 months. Robert Woods, Todd Gurley. So there's all the Rams.
Yeah.
Don't need Jared Goff.
No, not unless we're playing super flex.
No. All right. So there's all the Rams that I'm interested in stacking with Cam Newton.
So
and
now,
I'm going to say at most 2 of these.
Right. But you might want some Cam stacks without Rams that aren't game stacks, right? That are just like Carolina onslaughts. So you could leave this button just the way that it is right now, and that would be that. But you can also say, I think that I'd want more of the lineups that have Rams coming back than the lineups that don't. And so you can key boost. And so that little boost up in the kind of top right, once you click that, it opens up a field for each of the players. And now you can boost their projection, let's say, 10 to 15, 20%. And so every lineup that Cam Newton is in, that the optimizer chooses, it's now bumping these players' projection by this percentage and then making decisions for you based on these rules.
But it's locked only to lineups where Cam Newton is in, where the optimizer is building, and not done globally.
Exactly.
So it's kind of forcing game stacks.
So yeah, so what it does, instead of if you were making lineups from the global setting, you could force game stacks right away. But what this is doing is it's saying, okay, I don't necessarily want all my Cam Newtons to be game stacks, but I want some of them to be, and I want to boost the projections of the other players in this. Similarly, if you feel like players are negatively correlated, you could make a group that is like, if Saquon Barkley is used, then negative boost Sterling Shepard like 10 percentage points. You can do stuff like that. So this is a way to manage correlations in your lineups with this new key boost feature that we're really excited about. And
then before you leave, obviously hit save and it'll put it down here in all of your groups. On an average week, Drew, how many groups do you end up with?
Usually in the 60s.
Okay, so like I said, you got to spend time to make the optimizer dance. I never get as many as 60. I do make a lot of them. I make one for every quarterback. I make one for the ones that I want to game stack and bring somebody back. I build somewhere. If I find, I build around my core a lot. That's how I build lineups, right? I have a very truncated player pool versus some other max entry guys. If you look at the amount of players that I use on a week in, week out basis, usually between 45 and 60 or something in that range. Some guys use way more than that. Some guys use way less. That's about where I land every single week. So I want to make sure that all of my lineups have at least 2 of my core guys in them. So I'll make a group of my core guys for that week. Very easy to do with the DailyRoto value. You just go to flex, you sort by value, and then you can pick the guys that you want that are the highest values on the day, or the guys who project for the highest amount of fantasy points. Make a group and say at least 2 of these guys have to be in every lineup to give yourselves a higher floor, whether you're building cash games, whether you're building tournament lineups or whatever, with all of the other rules that you've put in. Groups help. They are the key to you building lineups using an optimizer, and the thing that you really have to play around with a lot. As you heard Drew say earlier in the video, he doesn't just show up on Sunday and then just hit the run optimizer button. Even with his groups, he's doing it over and over and over again. I spend an hour or 2 hours every Friday trying to get the thing to work the way that I want, and then I go again for another 2-3 hours on Sunday morning before I go live with the Anti-Tinkercast the same way, before I finally end up on the lineup set that I want. With the allocations that I want. So it's a lot of time being put in with the optimizer, adjusting individual projections for players, adjusting my groups. This key boost thing is a huge change that's really going to help you build the lineups that you want, as it goes on. The question in chat right now is, do groups transfer from week to week? There's going to be an issue with that because of programming and players being in and out of different player pools as you sort. So your settings, you can save in all these different things, and I would suggest making a settings lineup for main slate, for showdown slates, for truncated slates. I don't know how else to put it, just a smaller slate, right, where you're either playing early lineups or late lineups. You might even build one for 2 or 3 max slates that pop out throughout the year, if those are the ones that you play, so you can use a different setting group. Those transfer from week to week if you save them. The groups probably, I assume, do not, as Drew said off air, and I don't know if we're going to get that sort of functionality because of the difficulty in coding that.
Yeah, we'll see. I think that's something that's on the list to try, but I'm not sure if it will be fully functional. I know that groups will carry over from slate to slate during the same week, though.
And that's the thing. So like I built these groups, right? So I've got these Cam Newton groups that are built here. Let's say I'm going to build DraftKings lineups. All that stuff is great. And I've X'd out all these players that I've X'd out. And then I want to say, okay, I want to build 150 lineups over on FanDuel. Switch over to the main. My groups should remain there. I will still be building lineups the exact same way within the projections. And the value will differ from site to site based on how the salaries work out on those different sites. But my groups will remain the same. So I'll still get the same sort of lineups that I wanted with the allocations that I want from player to player, even moving from one site to the next, depending on where you're trying to use this optimizer to build lineups. So the groups function and the limiting your player pool, whether you do it manually like me, whether you use the settings through here to have minimum projections or whatever else, are all going to help you limit your player pools and be able to use that lineup creator throughout all the different sites. So what's left, Drew? What else is new on the optimizer this year that we haven't touched on, or anything that you want to hit on?
Those are the big things. The big things that we added this year was the key boost, which we're really excited about, and then the volatility aspect.
I love both those things.
There's certain things where, like, now if you run your lineups, you have the ability to run more after that. So like if you create 50 lineups with a certain settings group, and then you change the settings, you can run more and run another 50 if you'd like, that you've altered those settings. So there's different things like that like are post having run the optimizer once, that are there as new features as well. But that flexibility with being able to save your individual settings and kind of apply them throughout the season is really helpful and really useful, and it saves people a lot of time to week. So we're pretty excited about all these additions we've made.
Yeah, I think you guys did an outstanding job this off season. I want to thank you for being here once again, Drew, to do another one of these how to win on DraftKings videos. Best of luck to you this season. If you guys don't follow Drew on Twitter, it's at Drew Dinkmeyer. Go give him a follow and go check out DailyRoto. The link is down below in the description. Thank you guys once again for hanging out. This is a long video. I appreciate you guys making it to the end. Thank you for for being here once again. Click that like button, subscribe to the channel, ring the notifications bell. My Instagram is down below in the pinned comment. Please give me a follow over there if you would be so kind, and best of luck to you this NFL season. Bye.